An atheist journalist thought he had the perfect argument until Karoline Leavitt hit him with a story that changed everything. The stage was set. Bright lights beamed down on the sleek set of American Perspectives tonight, a show known for heated debates. At the center sat Karoline Leavitt, poised and composed. Across from her was Alan Brooks, a relentless journalist with a sharp reputation. Millions watched, anticipation thick in the air. The debate started with policy, economic issues, regulations, social matters. Karoline delivered confident, articulate responses. She wasn't just a politician. She was a communicator who connected beyond the studio. Then Alan shifted, a subtle move only a seasoned debater would notice. He was preparing for something deeper. "You often speak about faith as a guiding principle," he said, leaning forward. "But let's be honest. Christianity is declining. Science has given us answers faith never could, yet you still advocate for it. Why?" A murmur rippled through the studio. Karoline let the question sit. Alan wasn't just questioning her beliefs. He was challenging the relevance of faith itself. "There are millions," he continued, "who see faith as a crutch holding people back rather than moving them forward. Do you think that's fair, or are you unwilling to admit faith is losing its place?" The room tightened. Cameras zoomed in. Alan had lit a fire, and everyone waited. Would Karoline let it burn or extinguish it with something unexpected? But Karoline didn't rush to answer. She took a breath, tilted her head slightly, and gave a small, knowing smile. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. The audience was waiting. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she began, her voice steady, "that it holds people back. But let me ask you, Alan, what do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" Alan's lips twitched, but he didn't interrupt. "It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable," she continued. "When your job is secure, your family is healthy, and the world makes sense. But when the ground beneath you disappears, when your child is dying, when you're staring at a casket, when doctors say there's nothing more they can do, what do you reach for then?" The room was dead silent. Even the producers had stopped whispering. Alan adjusted his tie. "People turn to faith because they're desperate. That doesn't make it real. It makes it comforting." Karoline nodded. "Comfort isn't weakness. Faith is more than comfort. It's resilience, hope. It's what has kept people from collapsing under suffering for thousands of years." Alan exhaled. "But religious institutions have fueled wars, oppression, corruption. And yet, you defend faith?" "I won't deny that," she replied. "But faith has also driven courage, sacrifice, and kindness. It inspired the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, hospitals, charities. You can't erase that because some twisted faith for their own agendas." Alan studied her, momentarily silent. Karoline leaned in. "But if you really want to know why I believe," she said, pausing, "it's because of a woman I met 12 years ago." Alan's brow furrowed. "A woman?" Karoline nodded, her voice softening. "Her name was Margaret, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could shake." But no one, not Alan, not the audience, was prepared for the story she was about to tell. Karoline rested her hands on the table, fingers lightly interlaced. Her voice was quieter now, more deliberate. 12 years ago, I was fresh out of college, working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. Politics was everything to me. I thought policy was the most powerful force in the world. Then I met Margaret." Alan remained silent, his posture rigid. The audience leaned in. Margaret was 72. "I met her at a community outreach event for seniors. I was just doing my job listening, taking notes. But Margaret stopped me in my tracks." Karoline exhaled, as if the memory pressed against her. She wasn't loud, but when she spoke, people listened. She had this quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Alan wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was listening. She told me she had buried 2 sons, one from cancer, one from a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. No siblings, no close family left. And yet, she sat across from me, smiling, sipping tea, asking about my life. Karoline's voice tightened. I asked how she did it, how she endured so much loss and still sat there, warm and kind. She met Alan's gaze. She said, "Faith isn't about proof. It's what keeps you standing when there is no proof." Silence. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade. Every morning, she thanked God not because life had been easy, but because she was still here. Because she believed there was still purpose in the day she had left. Karoline exhaled. I thought I understood strength, but Margaret showed me what it really looked like. Alan blinked, opened his mouth, then shut it. Before he could speak, Karoline added something that changed everything. The weight of Karoline's words pressed down on everyone in the studio. The audience, usually quick to react, was completely still. Even the host hesitated. Karoline didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch. Alan finally cleared his throat. That's a powerful story, he admitted, his voice quieter. But don't you think it's just that a story? Margaret found something that worked for her. That doesn't make faith a universal truth. Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. You're right about one thing, she said. Faith isn't about proving something to others. It's about what people live through. And if you really listen, you'll hear that story told a million different ways. Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. That's my issue, Karoline. Faith isn't measurable. It's built on emotions, experiences, things that can't be qualified. And yet, people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Karoline tilted her head. You mean like hope? Alan blinked. What? Hope? She repeated. It's not measurable. It's not scientific. You can't prove it exists in any tangible way. And yet, people fight wars for it. They survive the impossible because of it. They hold on to it even when logic says they shouldn't. She let that sink in. Would you tell someone who lost their home in a tornado that their hope is just an emotional crutch? That their belief in something better isn't real because it can't be put under a microscope? Alan shifted but didn't interrupt. That's the thing about faith, Karoline continued. It's not about controlling people. It's about how they make sense of the hardest parts of life. You can call it irrational, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, still finds the strength to keep going, there's something in that. Something you can't measure, but you also can't ignore. Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His usual sharpness softened. He wasn't just debating anymore. He was thinking. The host interjected, sensing the shift. Alan, do you have a response? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward the audience, searching for a reaction. But no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its earlier edge. I think I need to process that. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had expected. It wasn't an explosive takedown. It was something far more rare, a moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would send shockwaves across the country, was still to come. Alan gave Karoline a small nod before removing his mic and stepping off stage. He didn't linger for small talk or post-show commentary. Instead, he walked straight toward the exit, his posture stiff, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Karoline, however, remained seated. She could hear the whispers from the crew, see the way the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved, others unsettled, but no one looked unaffected. The moment the cameras cut, the first wave hit. Her phone buzzed nonstop, messages, missed calls, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded. Clips of the exchange were already circulating. But what shocked Karoline most wasn't just the reaction from her usual supporters. It was the response from the other side. I don't consider myself religious, but what she said really made me think. I've never heard someone defend faith without attacking the other side. That was different. This wasn't just politics anymore. People weren't arguing the way they normally did. Sure, the usual critics were there, but something rare was happening. People weren't just reacting. They were listening. Her team scrambled to respond. News outlets ran headlines within the hour. Karoline Leavitt leaves journalists speechless. A rare debate moment no one saw coming. Did this conversation just shift the debate on faith in America? Even late-night talk shows, which rarely gave conservatives a fair shake, covered it, not with mockery, but genuine discussion. And then there was Alan. He had remained silent all night. No tweets, no interviews, no follow-ups. Normally, he controlled the narrative. But now? Nothing. Until the next morning. At exactly 8:37 in Mass, he broke his silence with a single post. I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview, realizing I had more questions than answers. That was it. No grand statement. No damage control. Just honesty. And that was all it took to set off another tidal wave. In the days that followed, the conversation only grew. What began as a standard political debate had transformed into something deeper. It wasn't just about Karoline or Alan anymore. It was about something people had been hesitant to admit for years. People were searching for something more. Podcasters, columnists, commentators all weighed in. Some called it a defining moment for faith in public discourse. Others, a wake-up call. But the most surprising reactions came from the most unexpected places. A well-known comedian, famous for ridiculing religion, admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that woman made me wish I did." And that's saying something. A prominent scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies." Last night, I was reminded why so many still hold on to belief, even in uncertainty. And then there were the emails. Karoline's inbox had always been full supporters, critics, political requests. But now, messages from people who didn't fit into any of those categories. One stood out. A woman named Rebecca wrote, "I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith long ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried. Not because I suddenly found God or anything dramatic, but because I realized something. I miss believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Karoline read the email twice, then a third time. She had spent years in politics, debating policies, fighting for laws. But this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about a conversation people had been too afraid to have. And Rebecca wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, more stories poured in. People shared their own Margarets, their grandmothers, neighbors, the stranger in a hospital waiting room who had whispered words of faith when they needed it most. This wasn't about proving one side right. It wasn't about conversions or ideological victories. It was about reminding people that faith, whether in God and humanity or in something yet to be understood, wasn't weakness. It was what kept people standing. As the buzz settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another political moment. It wouldn't fade in a news cycle or be lost in the noise of the internet. It was a reminder. No matter how divided people seemed, no matter how loudly the world shouted that faith was outdated or obsolete, people were still searching for meaning, searching for something beyond the tangible. Karoline never set out to change minds that night. She simply told a story. But sometimes, a story is all it takes. And if this one made you think, if it stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. Because sometimes, the answers we need don't come from winning an argument. They come from the conversations we never expected to have. If this story resonated with you, Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share the video with others so they can experience it too. Catch you in the next one. And remember, sometimes the answers we need come from the conversations we least expect.